in Fleet Street to show our concern and disgust at the way the newspapers had not covered the fire and ending up at Hyde Park Corner.
The house in New Cross Road is now a gutted, roofless monument to the dead, with flowers and wreaths and messages covering the boarded door. A New Cross Massacre Action Committee has been formed and is organising a march through London next Monday. Leading it will be Mrs. Amza Ruddock, who lost her daughter Yvonne and her son Paul in the fire that devastated Yvonne's birthday party.
Leela and the New Cross Massacre Action Committee travelled across the country mobilising for the protest and organised coaches to carry people to London for the day. The demonstration, called the Black People's Day of Action, took place on the 2nd of March.
That morning, going to Fordham Park, and then there being about 20 or 30 people there, and it was a bit drizzly, and it was like, oh my goodness, is this going to work? And then bit by bit, seeing the crowds of people turning up, and that feeling of, oh my God, this is, you knew then it was going to be momentous.
What was the atmosphere like?
On the demonstration itself, a lot of shouting, a lot of chanting, predominantly young people, and you can see from the mood on their faces, very militant, very angry, very determined.
Although it had already been agreed with the police that the march would cross the Thames over Blackfriars Bridge, when the protesters reached the bridge, the police had closed the bridge off. But the protesters broke through and turned west onto Fleet Street, the traditional centre of Britain's newspaper industry.
And it was in Fleet Street that their frustration exploded.
Yeah, as we entered Fleet Street, it was like entering a canyon because Fleet Street was quite narrow. And by then, we are sort of 15,000 strong. The demonstration has gained people as we're moving. People were jumping off buses. School children were climbing over walls of schools to get to the demonstration. And as we marched down Fleet Street, they started to catcall, shout at us and throw banana skins at the demonstration as we were marching down. It was very hostile.
What do you think the march achieved in the short term?
So I think it's the first statement made by that number of black people on the streets of Britain. It gives you a sense of power. And I think for the first time in Britain, for both generations, the first generation that had come in the 50s and 60s, and then the generation that had grown up in the late 60s and 70s, it certainly was, this Britain has to take us seriously and has to do something seriously in terms of equal rights and justice for the black community.
Some 15,000 to 20,000 people marched across London that day, demanding justice for the lives lost at the New Cross fire and insisting the black community in Britain be listened to. Since the fire, there have been 2 inquests, and both have resulted in open verdicts with the jury unable to decide on the cause of the fire. The Black People's Day of Action is seen as a significant point in Black British history and marked the beginning of a year of protest and unrest. Just a month after the march, tensions with the Metropolitan Police erupted after a sharp increase in its use of stop and search, leading to the Brixton riots.
May Cameron. The same decade that saw that upsurge in racial tension in Britain was also witness to an eruption of violence between followers of rival religions in India. In 1984, anti-Sikh violence resulted in thousands of deaths, rapes, and the displacement of thousands of people following a series of events that set India's Hindu majority against the Sikh minority. And a warning, this report from Aisleen Kaur contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing.
In June 1984, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered an attack on the holiest site in the Sikh religion, the Golden Temple in Amritsar. On October 31st of that year, Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards in what was thought to be a revenge attack.
We regret to announce the death of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. She was critically injured this morning.
Almost immediately, attacks against Sikhs began across the country. One of those killed was Nirpreet Kaur's father, Nirmal Singh. For her, it marked the beginning of a long journey seeking justice.
My father was a prominent person in the Sikh community, a tall, well-built Sikh who was also a successful businessman.
Nirpreet's father ran a transport business in West Delhi.
On 31st October in the morning, Jaiva, he saw that they are shouting the slogans, Khoon ka badla khoon.
Khoon ka badla khoon means blood will have blood.
Looting the shops of Sikhs and burning the vehicles of Sikhs. So he told to my father on that day that this is happening over there. My father came early to the house on that day.
Nirpreet's family lived in a predominantly Sikh area, which made it a target for mob attacks.
That evening, one of our neighbors also came to warn us that the situation was getting worse. A little later, 2 policemen came to our locality who assured to my father that we came for your safety.
Believing that the neighborhood was safe because of the police presence, the next morning Nirpreet's family went to the local Sikh temple or Gurdwara for morning prayers. Suddenly, they heard loud noises from outside. It was a mob of people marching towards their locality. Everyone present at the Sikh temple rushed home immediately.
I can see the smoke from fires burning in 4 different directions. 2 miles away, a man has been burnt alive. Gangs of Hindu youths are roaming the streets shouting slogans against Sikhs and burning taxis.
That mob had surrounded our house from all sides and they entered to my house. When I was surrounded by the crowds, my brother, whose age was 13 years old, with sword, he came out to help me. And my father also came outside and he said to the crowd that why are you beating my children?
Nirpreet says her father tried to resist the mob, but nothing worked. Even the policemen made no effort to rescue them. Soon, her father was surrounded by the mob.
The mob doused him with kerosene, and a policeman standing there threw a box of matches to the mob, who set him alight.
Nirpreet yelled out to her father, "Run away, Dad, the mob has left." Her father jumped into a nearby water drain to put out the fire.
But someone from the mob tied him with a rope and burnt him again. This happened twice, and the 3rd time they hit him with a rod and he fell on the floor. He never woke up.
16-year-old Nirpreet stood there watching in shock and disbelief, a sight that she says still haunts her.
When I returned home after watching what had happened to my father, I saw my house was burning and my mother was unconscious. There was police outside my house, but none of them helped us.
Nirpreet's neighbor, who was an Air Force officer, rescued the rest of her family. He drove them to a refugee camp at an Air Force station. But Nirpreet went back to her neighborhood to try and help others escape. It was then that she remembers seeing the local Congress Party MP Sajjan Kumar on the street encouraging the mob.
I witnessed a mob that was being exhorted by Sajjan Kumar. एक भी सरदार जिंदा नहीं बचना चाहिए. That it means not a single Sikh should be left alive. Kill all of them.
The words that came out of Sajjan Kumar's mouth changed everything for Nirpreet. She became determined to avenge her father's killing and started to campaign against the people she believed had stirred up the anti-Sikh violence. But her mother was worried about her safety.
My mother decided to send me to Punjab and I took admission in a local college. Here I joined a Sikh student organization. I got married to the leader of the organization at the age of 18.
The 1980s in Punjab was a very volatile time. It had become the epicenter of Sikh militancy. Armed Sikh separatists were carrying out attacks against non-Sikhs. Meanwhile, young Sikhs were being killed in fake encounters whereby the police would kill detainees and later claim that there had been a gun battle. Nirpreet's husband disappeared and she believes he was shot dead by the security forces.
To fight with the politicians is very difficult because they were on the power and I was a simple person.
By the time Nirpreet turned 18, she had lost the 2 most important men in her life to violence. She became even more outspoken in her campaign. But in 1986, she was arrested on suspicion of involvement in terrorist activities.
I spent 9 years in the jail for my fight for justice. My son was 10 months old and he was with me in jail. The time I spent gives me shivers till today.
In 1996, all the charges against Nirpreet were dropped and she was released from prison.
I had paid heavily for what happened to my father, but ones who killed him were roaming freely.
After her release, Nirpreet carried on campaigning against the people she believed were responsible for the 1984 anti-Sikh violence. In 2006, she joined forces with Harvinder Singh Fulka, a Sikh lawyer who was also campaigning for justice for the thousands of Sikh survivors who had been displaced by the violence of 1984.
On 2nd November 84, my house was attacked and it was a miraculous escape for me and my wife. Like every other Sikh, we also decided to go back to Punjab. But I went to the relief camp, and when I saw the state of affairs in the relief camp, I realized that there's a dire need of a lawyer over here. And these people who have lost everything, they are here. If we now go away, may not be able to pardon myself throughout my life.
Together, Nirpreet Kaur and Harvinder Singh Fulka worked to bring a case against Sajjan Kumar, the politician Nirpreet had seen calling for the killing of Sikhs in Delhi back in November 1984. In 2018, Kumar was convicted for inciting violence in Delhi and was sentenced to life in prison.
See, it was a very, very big movement for all of us, and if I may say, not only for we people, but it was a big movement for the country. There was so much of happiness among the people. Some semblance of some justice has been done. And I would say one of the biggest cases of the country, we had won that day.
I can't say that I'm happy, but at least I was satisfied. I'm in peace. The person who spoiled my life, he is also realizing what I suffer.
Nirpreet now lives in a small town in Punjab, where she works with the women survivors of 1984 by helping open businesses and providing education to the second and third generation of their children.
Nirpreet Kaur speaking to Ishleen Kaur. Nirpreet still lives in Punjab, where she continues to work with survivors of the 1984 violence and their descendants. Finally this week, the written word and politics. This is a story from Kenya, where there are more than 60 languages spoken, but where, even after the country's independence from Britain in 1963, nearly all the books available on the shelves were in English, the language of the former colonialists. Rebecca Kesby has been hearing from the man who made it his life's mission to publish in Kenya's other official language, Kiswahili, and various other local languages.
At that time, no, there was no publisher publishing in English locally. There was no publisher publishing in Kiswahili, and there was no publisher publishing in local languages.
This is Dr. Henry Chakava. In 1972, he just graduated with a double first and was about to pursue an academic career abroad. To kill some time before beginning a scholarship, he took a temporary job at Heinemann Publishers, which had opened a new office in Nairobi. It was a decision with lasting consequences.
Well, it changed my life in the sense that I was supposed to be at Heinemann for only about 3 or 6 months, and I stayed there forever.
Henry Chakava became the first African editor at Heinemann. In the 1960s, the publisher had developed the African Writers series, championing the work of writers such as Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. But until that point, it had all been written and printed in English. Henry Chakava would play a crucial role in changing that.
We had decided consciously to launch a Kiswahili series from the books which were published in the African Writers series. So it was when people started seeing books appearing in Kiswahili that they said, well, we can give you some original works which you can also publish in the same series. We were receiving a lot of manuscripts coming in fact more than we could handle. So my job was really to go through all these manuscripts and come up with a few that we could consider for publishing.
Kiswahili, or Swahili, is widely spoken in many countries throughout East and Central Southern Africa. Historically, it was the language of commerce, which accounts for the number of words borrowed from Arabic, Persian, and even Portuguese, picked up from traders sailing up and down the coast. In fact, the first known written examples of it are in the Arabic script, but European colonialists introduced the Latin alphabet and standardized the language, which did help to cement it as a tool for international communication. When countries in the region gained their independence, it made sense to promote Kiswahili as an official language of government and education. But English remained dominant.
There were a lot of white people around, I can tell you. My own education, for example, in secondary school, I was educated by white people. Most of the teachers there were white. And even in the civil service, we still had quite a number of white people. In fact, as I entered publishing, I also found a lot of white people in the industry. So in the 60s, it was the transition between white people to the blacks. There was what we called Africanization. Well, I think it was all to do with creating a new nation.
And you decided early on that publishing in Kiswahili, whilst groundbreaking in itself, didn't go far enough. You decided that you needed to start publishing in other regional languages too.
I felt that all these languages were important and they needed to be given their rightful place. Language is our culture. Language is the best way to express ourselves. You grow in language. So it's very, very important for one to learn to write and to speak in their own mother tongues first. My first 3 years of primary school were taught in mother tongue, and I was able to grasp my mother tongue completely before I could start with Kiswahili and English.
And what do you think happens if a child is introduced to education in a foreign language as the primary language of learning?
I think that they completely lose grip of their culture. They get lifted into an environment which is not theirs. I think they lose their identity completely. They don't have that wholeness of their personality. When they start speaking their different languages before they have mastered their mother tongues. African languages are important and they need to be used. They need to be taught. They need to be developed. And it doesn't take too much to give them room to just reveal themselves.
Henry began producing books and other educational material in several of Kenya's languages, including his own, Kiramagoli, from Western Kenya.
Kunye abarogoli kobeye abandu bemirembe, which means we Maragoli people are a people of peace. Kusangala ulimi babarogoli babaguga betu. We are celebrating the language of our ancestors.
Whilst the government encouraged the learning of mother tongue in early education, there were no textbooks, no curriculum, nothing to introduce a child to the written form of their own language, and precious little in Kiswahili either.
Kiswahili ni lugha yetu ya taifa, which means Kiswahili is our national language. Mkosa kabila ni mtumwa. If you don't have your culture, you are a slave.
But it wasn't just in early education that there were discussions about the need to write in African languages. In the mid-70s, Kenya's most famous writer and Henry's former university professor, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, made what was seen as the political choice to write primarily in his mother tongue, Gikuyu. It was deeply controversial. Gikuyu is spoken by one of the largest ethnic groups in Kenya. Ngugi was writing plays and pieces about corruption and political misconduct, and in a language that ordinary people could understand. Henry was publishing them, and they soon both fell foul of the authorities.
I was there with him from the beginning. All this discussion which you are talking about, we had it together. Some of the books that he wrote would never have seen the light of day had I not published them.
So what happened then? Because he was detained by the authorities shortly after beginning to write in Gikuyu, because it was considered that radical, even subversive, to write in his own language.
After Ngugi left detention, I gave him space in my publishing house. I gave him a chair and a desk where he was sitting and doing his writing. The books that he wrote, like Gai Kandenda, which is I Will Marry When I Want, he wrote them in my office. And it was considered very dangerous to publish him. In fact, very dangerous to associate with him. I was also tortured, in fact, because of my stand on publishing Ngugi. I was attacked at my gate and beaten up. I knew it had something to do with the authorities. They would ring me and they would threaten me and they would tell me not to continue publishing Ngugi. They would come and collect all the books that were in stock. They would take them away and I would still bring in some more. I think that emphasizes what language can do, because while he published in English, he was not considered so controversial.
Didn't you fear for your own safety?
I didn't actually feel that I was exposing myself to so much danger until it happened, but I didn't want to stop. I continued because I believed that I had to publish those books. They needed to be published, and who else would publish them?
Your experience really proves how powerful speaking the authentic language of the people is, because if it wasn't, it wouldn't have been so politically dangerous.
Absolutely. That is the contradiction. Because if you listen to politicians seeking office, they use these languages to campaign. But when they come to parliament, they start speaking English. But we need to do more in terms of publishing more books for our own culture and for our own history. There's so much that we could write about, and there's so much that could be truly and genuinely African.
Henry Chakava went on to establish the East African Educational Publishers in the 1990s. He's published hundreds of novels and educational books in several languages and has received many awards for his services to publishing and education. So does he ever regret giving up that promising career in academia?
I don't regret it, and I think I've achieved a lot more in publishing than I would have done in academia. I am happy. I'm happy the way things have ended out.
Dr. Henry Chakava was speaking to Rebecca Kesby. His story will be added to our ever-expanding archive of first-hand recollections of moments from African history, which you can find online by looking for BBC Witness History Collections. It's an excellent resource covering a wide range of topics, not just from Africa. We've got a Soviet section, a Chinese section, the First and Second World Wars, space, science. There's even a section on animals who made history. That's it, though, for this week's History Hour. To quote Donald Trump as he left Washington, "We'll be back." The difference is, we'll be back next week. Not sure about the Donald. This is Max Pearson. Until the next time, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, meeting the people behind the internet's original viral videos.
My goodness, it's the video that so many people have been talking about.
What's it like to go viral? Millions or even hundreds of millions of people watching and sharing you online. I'm Colm Flynn, meeting some of the internet's biggest and first viral video stars.
My viral video and me at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our technology reporter Zoe Kleiman told us more.
I asked our Washington correspondent Chris Buckler what was in this article.
Well, our Europe regional editor Mike Sanders is here in the studio.
Let's speak to our China media analyst Kerry Allen from BBC Monitoring.
On air, online and on smartphone, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station. America has a new president, but will Joe Biden, the 46th man in the office, be good for business? On Business Weekly, we'll ask whether he can match Donald Trump's self-proclaimed economic triumphs.
Some of his advisors I know are whispering in his ear this very thing. Make major investments in infrastructure, in public health, in education. Those investments will pay off.
We speak to the director of the hit series Lupin to find out why she thinks Netflix is good for non-English language television.
We can shoot in our language. We are allowed to talk about our culture. We are completely free. They can give you even more freedom than a producer.
And who owns colour? It's not quite black and white. We'll explain more after the latest world news.
BBC News, I'm John Shea. Russian police have begun clearing the streets in central Moscow, where tens of thousands have rallied in support of the jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Riot police are out in big numbers in Pushkin Square, beating and detaining demonstrators who are pushing back. Sarah Rainsford is there.
In the last hour or so, the situation here has become a lot more tense. The riot police have basically started to clear the streets. They've been joining arms, locking arms. In fact, looking at right in front of me right now, they've got their batons up and they are periodically surging towards the crowd. I've seen people being beaten. I've seen people being detained. The intention appears to be, as I say, to get these protesters off the streets. The crowd has in, certainly, but there's a lot of people still in the side streets. Some of them have been trying to march around the boulevard ring here in the centre of Moscow, and again, the riot police have been trying to stop them. So at the moment, we're basically standing in amongst cars that have been blocked on one of the streets here, and as I say, the riot police forming in front of us with their batons up. The protesters themselves seem to be just as determined as the police. They've been shouting freedom to Alexei Navalny. They've been saying, let him go. And they've been shouting anti-Putin chants as well, calling him a thief. They've been saying he's corrupt, and they've been saying they want him to go.
An independent monitoring group says more than 1,000 arrests have been made in Moscow and other cities across Russia, where rallies began earlier in the day. Foreign forces in Libya appear to have ignored a deadline set for their withdrawal from the country in line with the ceasefire agreement. Alan Johnston reports.
Both Libya's warring parties have had backing from abroad. The government in the capital, Tripoli, has been helped by the Turkish military, which has flown in mercenaries from Syria. On the other side of the front lines, General Khalifa Haftar is known to have had support from Russian mercenaries. Under a ceasefire deal brokered by the UN 3 months ago, all the foreign forces in Libya were meant to have left by today. But reports from the ground say there's been no sign of any significant withdrawal.
The aid organisation SOS Mediterranee says it's rescued more than 350 migrants off the Libyan coast over the past 2 days. It says almost half are children, the majority of them unaccompanied, including 4 babies. A spokesman for the Afghan Taliban says the militant group is committed to its bilateral agreement with the United States and wants Washington to stick with it. Speaking in Doha, where Afghan peace talks are continuing, the spokesman told the BBC that the Taliban wanted full compliance. The deal, signed a year ago, facilitates a conditional US withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Biden administration has said it will review the agreement in the light of the continuing violence, a move welcomed by the Afghan government. This is the latest world news from the BBC. The celebrated American broadcaster Larry King has died at the age of 87. He'd been receiving treatment for COVID-19 in Los Angeles. Daniela Ralph reports.
Born in Brooklyn, he began his broadcasting career in his 20s as a disc jockey in Florida. By the 1970s, he was broadcasting his late-night radio show Coast to Coast. And then, in the 80s, he joined a new 24-hour TV news station, CNN, gently probing everyone from presidents to Oscar winners. After leaving CNN, he launched a new talk show that was criticised for being syndicated on the Russian-sponsored TV network RT. But with a star-studded lineup of guests, Larry King proved that even in his 80s, he still had unrivaled pulling power.
Police in the Indian state of Madhya Pradesh have used water cannon, tear gas and batons to break up an anti-government protest led by members of the opposition Congress Party. Several police officers and protesters were injured. The rally in Bhopal was supporting India's farmers, who were involved in a long-running dispute with the country's central government about new agricultural reforms. Saudi Arabia says its air defences have thwarted an attempted strike on the capital Riyadh. State media blamed the attack on Houthi rebels in neighbouring Yemen. They've often launched missiles across the border in the past, but they deny being involved in this latest assault. The Saudis back Yemen's government in its war with the Houthis. Pope Francis has praised the role of journalists in strengthening society and democracy in the digital age, but he urged reporters to go out onto the streets more often to understand the reality of people's lives. The Pope said investigative reporting was too often being replaced by a partisan narrative, which was wrapped in superficial soundbites and unable to grasp problems and aspirations at the grassroots level. BBC News.
Hello, thank you for joining me here on Business Weekly. I'm Lucy Burton, and let's kick off the programme today with a little bit of this.
Love to start every show with Lady Gaga. And of course, there she is singing at Joe Biden's inauguration as the 46th President of the United States. The man who for many years was a vice president finally took the top job.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
Office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
At his side, his wife and family, and of course Kamala Harris, the first female vice president, the first vice president of colour. I want to play you a bit of this too. This is the first National Youth Poet Laureate, Amanda Gorman, taking to the stage to read her poem, The Hill We Climb.
While once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free.
The pandemic and the fear of violence meant that the usual inauguration crowds were replaced by flags planted along the National Mall. The idea, said Biden's team, was to represent America united. And number 46's inauguration speech put that theme front and centre as he begins the process of bringing the country together after the tumultuous last few weeks and indeed the last 4 years of the Trump administration.
America has been tested and we've come out stronger for it. We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's challenges. And we'll lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example.
The new president wasted no time undoing Trump-era policies. The presidential permit for the controversial Keystone XL oil pipeline between the States and Canada was revoked, and preparations were made for the US to recommit to the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as the World Health Organization. The new White House press office quickly released a photo of him behind the famous Oval Office desk, pen in hand. And behind that desk is where he's going to have to be over the coming months, because his inbox is quite simply enormous. First of all, he's got to deal with the pandemic. 400,000 Americans have now died from COVID-19. Then there's that $1.9 trillion stimulus bill he wants to get through Congress. And then there's the huge threat of climate change. And there's a relationship with China and Russia, and the list goes on and on and on. But getting the economy back on track is vital. So what do businesses hope to gain from a Biden presidency? Ivana Davidovich reports.
The United States is in the midst of an economic boom, the likes of which the world has never seen before. America is thriving, America is flourishing, and yes, America is winning again like never before.
This was President Trump just a year ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He was 10 months from the US elections and saw the buoyant economy as his ticket to a second term. At that point, unemployment was at its lowest since the late 60s and growth was averaging a solid 2.5% per year. He just needed to bring the ship into the port, when the whole world was turned upside down.
Breaking news tonight, the coronavirus outbreak declared a global pandemic, and now the extreme new measures in the U.S. Also, hospitals sounding the alarm, growing fears they'll be overwhelmed if there's a surge in patients. Small businesses taking a big hit as people stay home. On Wall Street,
the coronavirus pandemic created a devastating health and economic crisis. America's death toll currently stands at over 400,000. 10 months into the pandemic, the US economy still has around 10 million jobs to recover, and almost 19 million Americans are still claiming some form of unemployment benefit. At the sharp end of all this are people like Shayonte Moulton from Texas, who was getting by as a food delivery driver before her life took a turn for the worse.
I used to DoorDash, and then a pipe fell off the back of a semi-truck on the freeway,
and it blew out 2 of my tires and damaged my rims, and it costs quite a bit of money to get that fixed, which I had to pull from my rent money.
Hello?
And
Thanks
then
for
it kind of
ordering a channel review.
after
My name is
that.
The mum of 4 not only lost her income, but also her health insurance, leaving her no choice, she says, but to fundraise online to cover medical bills.
Quite frankly, it's a little embarrassing, but I've gotten past that part. I feel like healthcare should be one of the things that is a priority in this country because there's so many people that are slipping through the cracks.
Joe Biden has promised that people like Shionte will not be forgotten. No time to waste. That was the message from him as he announced plans last week for a $1.9 trillion relief package that included stimulus checks, an increased federal minimum wage, as well as hundreds of billions of dollars for struggling businesses.
If we invest now boldly, smartly, and with unwavering focus on American workers and families,